لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم. I welcome you back to our course on Imam al-Hadrami's Safinat Al-Naja, a course in beginner Shafi'i fiqh. This is a level 1 covering ibadat, worship from a Shafi'i primer, and we commence where we left off, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Our course outcomes are to introduce our students to Islamic law, to have a first step into the legacy of the Shafi'i school, and to learn the 5 pillars of Islam at a beginner level. In this lesson, bi'idhnillah, we will look at the conditions of prostration or sujood, the prayer times, awqatus salah, as well as the unlawful times for prayer, the times in which it is haram to commence a prayer. We commence with a hadith by Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, quite relevant to the text that we are currently dealing with. It reads, عن النبي صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وسلم قال إن أول ما يحاسب الناس به يوم القيامة من أعمالهم الصلاة. Indeed, the first of that which people will be taken into account for on the Day of Judgment is about their prayer. The hadith then further reads that if everything is found to be sound, فَإِن صَلَحَتْ فَقَدْ أَفْلَحَ وَأَنْجَحَ, if the person is able to answer the question about prayer successfully, meaning that they prayed all their prayers, that they prayed them fulfilling the arkan and the shurut, and importantly that they prayed them on time, then this would suffice as a means of success. In other words, they will be successful for the rest of the examination on that day. If they fail, then before taking them to task, Allah Azza wa Jal, in His infinite wisdom and mercy, He asks the angels to check if they have supererogatory acts of worship, prayer, that can fill in the gaps that were missing with that which was obligatory. And if it is found to be successful, in other words, if they manage to fill those gaps, alhamdulillah. But if not, فَقَدْ خَابَ وَخَسِرَ, then the person has already failed the test of the Day of Judgment, and all of the other acts of worship will follow suit. So in Islam, our salah is essentially like our yardstick for worship. All our physical acts of worship are embodied, or the pinnacle of it is in the form of the salah. So on the Day of Judgment, according to this hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the first question Allah Azza wa Jal will ask us about is in fact about our salah. And insha'Allah, through our learning these important matters and putting them into practice in our lives, we would have managed to attain the objective bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us success. Ameen. So the segment of text that we are dealing with today, قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا الله بعلومه وعلومكم آمين, في شروط السجود, the chapter regarding the conditions of prostration. شروط السجود سبعة, the conditions of prostration are 7. أن يسجد على 7 أعضاء, and to يسجد, prostrate, على 7, on 7 أعضاء, 7 limbs. And of course, we will explain all of these points in detail as we proceed. وأن تكون جبهته مكشوفة, for the person's forehead, in other words, the part of the face that touches the ground, it needs to be makshufatan, bare. So there must be no covering, no barrier between the person's head and the ground. وَالتَّحَامُلُ بِرَأْسِهِ, the person should also carry the weight of his head on the ground. وَعَدَمُ الْهُوِيِّ لِغَيْرِهِ, the person should not prostrate for any other purpose except for prostration. We've given examples of this. وَأَلَّا يَسْجُدَ عَلَى شَيْءٍ يَتَحَرَّكُ بِحَرَكَتِهِ, and he should also not make sajda upon anything that moves as he moves. وَارْتِفَاءُ أَسْفَالِهِ عَلَى أَعْيَالِهِ أو أَعَالِهِ, he needs to raise the bottom part of his body, meaning his backside, عَلَى أَعَالِهِ, over the highest part of his body, meaning his head, which is a natural occurring position in the sajda. وَالطُّمَأْنِينَةُ فِيهِ, and there must also be a moment of pause, a moment of stillness in that position where all the limbs come to a brief stop. So we've been through this section of text before. This is a mere revision, so I won't go through it in great detail, but it rounds up the discussion of the previous section. So what have we just stated? We said that the conditions of sajda are 7. They are to prostrate upon 7 limbs. The forehead should be exposed, to make sajda by resting the head on the ground and not keeping the weight of the head up. Not to intend anything by the sajda except the sajda itself. So you're not trying to avoid any insects or the like. That's just an example of why somebody might want to go into sajda, even though they're supposed to go into sajda. They're actually going into sajda because there's a flying insect coming their way. Then number 5, not to prostrate on anything that moves with one's own movement. So for example, a scarf, a shawl, something of the sort. Number 6, that one's rear be higher than one's head, which is again a naturally occurring motion or position. The head is going to be on the ground, so the backside is going to be raised above the head. So that happens quite effortlessly. Of course, assuming somebody's making sajda in the usual way. And then number 7, to remain motionless for a moment while prostrating, meaning to have complete stillness, to have complete rest in that position of sajda before moving on to the next position in order for that position to be valid. So we went through this already. Again, this is a revision. You have your footnotes over there. And of course, the sharh from Nailur Raja. We continue with the last segment of this particular segment, this section in the text, inshallah ta'ala. Khatima, a seal. Fi a'da'i sujud, what are the limbs of prostration? A'da'u sujudi sab'atun, the limbs of prostration are sab'atun, 7. Al-jabhatu, the forehead. Wa butunul kaffaini, the insides of one's hands, the palms of the hands. وَالرُّكْبَتَانِ, the 2 knees. وَبُطُونُ أَصَابِعِ الرِّجْلَيْنِ, and the insides or the bottom parts of one's toes. So the head, of course, goes in the ground uncovered. The hands goes flat onto the ground and not raised up with one's fingers like that, but flat onto the ground. So the knees have to touch the ground as well. And then as far as the toes are concerned, if you imagine my hand to be a foot and the fingers representing the toes, then when you go into sajda, the bottoms of the toes are flat on the ground with the toes pointing forward towards the qibla while the foot is upright in that manner. As you can see by the translation here, the forehead, both palms, both knees, and the portion under the toes of each foot. Those are the 7 limbs of prostration. For the Hanafis, the nose is also included. So it is recommended in the Shafi'i school as a means of khuruj min al-khilaf. Scholars have differed about a particular limb. Some scholars in this instance regard the limb as being a requirement for sajda. Others do not regard it as such. So in order to be safe by the maximum number of opinions, we go with the safer view, which is to also have the nose on the ground, even though it is not a requirement in the Shafi'i school. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. In the next section, we are once again dealing with the shaddas. And the reason why the emphasis is placed on the tashdidat or the shaddas in these various segments is because these are the sections of the salah wherein you have to recite this. Remember, in the salah, the physical actions for the most part are more important than the verbal actions, than the verbal communication. So the only recitation that is obligatory is the Takbiratul Ihram, Suratul Fatiha, and the final Tashahud. And for that reason, as well as the Salam actually, but for that reason, these elements of recitation have been included, pointing out exactly where one should emphasize, in other words, have a shadda. So there's not much to explain here. It's just the point of noticing where the tashdidat are. But as far as implementation is concerned, it would be best to recite both the Fatiha and the Tashahud to a teacher who can ensure that one is reciting them correctly, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. As far as the theory is concerned, we merely need to read through this and notice where those shaddas occur. So we proceed. Faslun fi tashdidati tashahudi. a chapter regarding the shaddas of the tashahhud. تشديدات التشهد 21. The shaddas of the tashahhud are 21, 21. خمس في أكمله, there are 5 in the optimum form. وستة عشر في أقله, and there are 16 in the minimal form. So remember, you could either recite the tashahhud in the absolute complete way, which includes the entire salawat al-Ibrahimiyyah, or you could recite it in a minimalistic way, which includes less than that. So we will look at what is included, inshallah. At-tahiyatu ala ta'i wal ya. So what I'll do now is I'll read through them and just circle the areas where the shaddas are, even though they should be apparent to you as well. So the ta and the ya. Al-mubarakatu salawat ala sad. So on the sad of as-salawat. At-tayyibatu على الطاء والياء. لله على اللام الجلالة. So in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. السلام على السين. عليك أيها النبي. على الياء والنون والياء. ورحمة الله على لام الجلالة. ورحمة الله. وبركاته السلام على السين. علينا وعلى عباد الله على اللام الجلالة. الصالحين على الصاد. أشهد أن لا إله إلا على اللام ألف. إلا الله على اللام ألف ولام الجلالة. وأشهد أن على النون محمد رسول الله على ميم. وعلى الراء على ميم محمد وعلى الراء وعلى اللام الجلالة. طيب, so that basically covers the tashdidat of the tashahhud. The next segment is exactly the same, pointing out the tashdidat. فصل في تشديدات الصلاة على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. The segment on the shaddas in the salawat upon the Prophet Muhammad صلى الله عليه وسلم. تشديدات أقل الصلاة, the shaddas on the minimum form of salawat على النبي upon the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. أربع, they are 4. اللهم على اللام والميم. صلي على اللام. على محمد على ميم على الميم. Same thing applies to the next section as well. فصل في أقل السلام, a chapter regarding the minimum form of salam, which is to say السلام عليكم. أقل السلام السلام عليكم. تشديد السلام على السين. So we find one shadda in here on the seen, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. There really isn't much more to explain for this, so I haven't included the sharh. It's a one-pager. It basically just replicates the text. There's not much to add there, and Allah knows best. Now we proceed to the next segment that requires our attention in terms of explanation itself, and that is the section pertaining to the times of prayer. So we opened up this class with a hadith by Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala an, reported in the Jami of Imam Tirmidhi and other sources as well, that the first question we'll be asked about on the Day of Judgment is about our salah. And part of that question is, of course, the punctual performance of the salah and whether the salah was performed in its due time or not. The first evidence for this is in fact from the Quran itself, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ كَانَتْ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ كِتَابًا مَوْقُوتًا. The salah has been fixed at prescribed times for the believers. So they have to be performed within a particular slot of time. Now Muslims, we generally know this, but the extent of our knowledge can sometimes mislead. So I've met many Muslims who theoretically know that prayer must be performed on time. But there are two extremes in misunderstanding this. The one extreme is, look, there is a time for the prayer, right? And it would be great to perform the prayer at that time. But as long as you pray the salah on that particular day, you're fine. So as a result of this mistaken belief, some Muslims, they proceed to work every day. They don't pray at work. They come home in the evening and they fulfill all their prayers. As in Cape Town, we call it the Taraweeh prayer, but it's not an actual Taraweeh prayer. It's sort of a ridiculing of this practice, because it is invalid to deliberately not pray within its specific time and then to consider it as being valid to pray later. Understand that this is incorrect. This is qada salah. This is a missed prayer and you're making up for the prayer, but you're not compensating for the sin that has already occurred by not praying on time. So that's the one extreme. The other extreme is, of course, that the person believes that praying on time means praying at the beginning of its time. So you have to pray right when the waqt enters, which is when the adhan sounds. And if you don't pray then you haven't prayed, or you are sinful. This is also a misunderstanding. It is the optimal to pray at that time, but the window of validity for one's prayer extends throughout the duration of that particular prayer's time. Within that time, you get a best time to pray, you get a preferred time to pray, and then you get a disliked time to pray, and then of course you get a prohibited time to pray. So we will elaborate on those elements as well. What is important for us to note is, how do we determine the times of the prayer, both theoretically as well as practically? And then how do we compartmentalize the duration in order to determine when exactly is the best time to pray, when is the preferred time to pray, or a good time to pray rather, when is it disliked, and when does it become haram, bi'idhnillah. So looking at the course text, قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا الله بعلومه وعلومكم فصل في أوقات الصلاة, a chapter regarding the times of the prayer. أوقات الصلاة خمسة, the times of the prayer are 5, because there are 5 compulsory prayers. أول وقت الظهر, the commencement of the time of Dhuhr prayer. زوال الشمس is when the sun passes its zenith. We will explain this again. For now, let's just look at the English translation, inshallah. وآخره, the end of the time of Dhuhr. مصير ظل الشيء is when the shadow of something becomes مثله, the same size of the object. غير ظل الاستواء, minus the shadow that is present at the time of zenith. Tamam? So we will explain this. For now, just consider the translation. وأول وقت العصر, the beginning of the time of Asr. إذا صار ظل كل شيء, when the shadows of everything, مثله, becomes the same size as those things. وزاد قليلا, and slightly more. وآخره, the end of the time of Asr. غروب الشمس is at the time of the setting of the sun, when the disk of the sun disappears. وأول وقت المغرب, the beginning of the time of the Maghrib prayer. غروب الشمس is the setting of the sun, when the disk of the sun disappears. وآخره, and the end of the time of the Maghrib prayer. غروب الشفق الأحمر is the disappearance of the red twilight. Now what you'd notice so far, other than of course the description of when the time begins and when they end, is the fact that Dhuhr ends at the point where Asr begins. Asr ends at the point where Maghrib begins. So they are all interconnected. And the same thing will apply with Isha. So let's look at that as well. وَأَوَّلُ وَقْتِ الْعِشَاء, the beginning of the time of Isha prayer. غُرُوبُ الشَّفَقِ الْأَحْمَرِ is when the red twilight disappears. وَآخِرُهُ, and the end of the time of Isha is طلوع الفجر الصادق, is when the true dawn rises, meaning when Fajr commences. So again, Maghrib continues until Isha prayer enters. And Isha prayer continues until Fajr enters. So all of the prayers are connected to one another. The only exception is the following, which is the Fajr prayer. When the Fajr prayer ends, it's not Dhuhr, of course, right? So, أول وقت الصبح, the beginning of the time of Fajr is طلوع الفجر الصادق, when true dawn rises. We'll explain all of these in a moment, inshallah. وآخره, the end of the waqt of Subh or Fajr is طلوع الشمس, when the sun rises, when the first rays of the sun comes up from the horizon. And then he continues to describe the various types of horizons. Al-ashfaqu thalathatun, horizons of three types. Ahmaru wa asfaru wa abyadu. There's the red horizon or twilight, there's the yellow horizon or twilight, and there's the white horizon or twilight. Al-ahmaru, the red is maghribun, that represents sunset. Wal asfaru, the yellow. Wal abyadu, and the white represents isha'un, the time of Isha. وَيُنْدَبُ تَأْخِيرُ صَلَاةِ الْعِشَاءِ, it is recommended to delay the Isha prayer إِلَىٰ أَن يَغِيبَ الشَّفَقُ الْأَصْفَرُ, till the time of the yellow twilight disappearing, وَالْأَبْيَضُ, as well as the white twilight disappearing. Now that was just the translation, and inshallah any points that were unclear will become clear shortly. Looking at the translation and allowing us a time to explain this as well, we see the following. In this section, the times of Salah are 5, right? It is best to pray every prayer at the beginning of its time, taking the necessary steps at its outset, such as purification, clothing one's awrah, giving the adhan and iqamah, and then praying. If less than one rak'ah of one Salah occurs within the proper time, okay, just ignore that for now. That's a bit premature. So there's 5 daily salahs, and the best time to pray each salah is at the beginning of its waqt, meaning when the time just enters, right? So keep that in mind. He starts off with a discussion of dhuhr time. Now this may puzzle somebody for the first time. Why are we discussing dhuhr first when in fact Fajr is the first prayer of the daytime? Well, there's a number of ways to go about this. Maghrib is technically the first prayer of the day, because the day starts with nighttime in Islam. And Fajr is technically the first prayer of daylight. But the reason for starting with Dhuhr time is because when Jibreel ﷺ taught the Prophet ﷺ how to pray and the times of prayer, he started with Dhuhr. So our scholars have continued with this method, and Allah knows best. There's other reasons as well, but we'll stick to this. The time for Dhuhr begins after the sun descends from its zenith. Now you will see here, it says in brackets, Zawal, because the sun descending from its zenith is what is referred to as Zawal. That is correct. But the zenith itself is not the same as Zawal, and people often mistake this for one another. So that's a misnomer, right? You would see throughout the world, on calendars, they would indicate the time of Zawal. And then slightly later than that, they indicate the time of Dhuhr. For the most part, what is intended hereby is when the sun is at its highest point and then the time of Dhuhr. But those terminologies are incorrect. The sun being at its highest point in the sky is not called Zawal. That's called al-Istiwa in Arabic and Zenith in English. This means that there is no point throughout the day in which the sun is higher in the sky than at that point. Now, this is going to differ depending on where in the world you are observing the sun. Geographically speaking, between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer, there is what we call the equator in the middle. And I think I should perhaps just demonstrate this in the form of a picture or drawing. That would be optimal. But for now, inshallah, let me just explain it first instead of trying to draw a diagram. The sun, the earth is round, the sun is round, the earth revolves around the sun, and the earth also tilts on its own axis. So this causes different seasons in the year. It causes night and day. So depending on where you are in the world and where you are on the globe, the sun is going to be at its highest point for different places at different points in the sky. In some places, like in the middle, on the equator and between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, there will be a time in the year where the sun is directly above you. In other words, it's straight up in the sky, casting no shadows on the ground, because the shadow of the object is going to be directly underneath the object. And this will only happen for a certain number of days during the year, or for a certain time period in the year. And thereafter, it will continue to have a shadow even when the sun is at its highest point. If you are north of the Tropic of Cancer or south of the Tropic of Capricorn, then regardless of what time in the year it is, there will always be a shadow when the sun is at its highest point. And that's simply because of the geographical phenomenon that we've pointed out. When the sun is at its highest point in the sky, regardless of where you are, at that moment, it is unlawful to pray. It's a very difficult moment to capture because it's literally a moment. The sun and the earth, these heavenly bodies, they continue to move all the time. There's no point at which they pause and say, well, okay, right now it's haram to make salah. They continue moving. So the moment when the sun is at its highest point in the sky, istiwa, or the zenith, at that moment it's haram to pray. Then the rotation continues and the sun moves beyond its highest point. So now it starts to set slightly, technically speaking. And on that setting trajectory, the moment it passes its highest point, we call that zawal, right? Zalati shams. The sun has moved away from its highest point. And once the sun makes zawal, in other words, once the sun passes its highest point, it is the waqt of dhuhr immediately. So on the calendar, if you state zawal is at this time, then that is dhuhr time. But of course, we need to take into consideration the misunderstanding of these terms when people publish these calendars and the like. So zawal is when the sun moves away from its highest point. Istiwa is when the sun is at its highest point, right? So that's important to understand this text as we proceed. Not that text. This text. Tamam. So the time of dhuhr begins after the sun descends from its zenith, its highest point. The moving away from its highest point is called zawal. And it ends when an object's shadow equals its length in addition to the length of its shadow at the time of zawal. So here's the diagram that I was looking for, and it goes as follows, right? So bear with me here. When the sun is at its highest point, it's called the zenith. The moment it moves beyond the highest point, that's now zawal, and the waqt of dhuhr has entered. So after the zenith, no shadow of object used, plus the shadow present at zenith time. After the zenith here, if you place a stick in the ground, that red line represents a stick. When the sun is at its highest point, assuming that you are either on the Tropic of Capricorn or all the way up to the Tropic of Cancer, somewhere at that point, and it's summertime and the sun is directly above, that would mean that the shadow is zero at the time of zenith. Anywhere else to the north of Cancer or to the south of Capricorn, you are going to have a shadow at the time of zenith, right? Whether it is a short shadow like this or whether it is a long shadow like that depends on how north or how south you are. So the rule is that the waqt of dhuhr begins when the sun moves away from its highest point, but it continues until the shadow of the object is the same size as the object. So here, this is the shadow and this is the object. So once the shadow of the object and the object itself are of equal sizes, then the waqt of dhuhr has ended and the waqt of asr enters. But there's the other bit of shadow to take into consideration. So remember we said that depending on where you are in the world, you may have a shadow present at the time of zenith. So let's say our shadow was about the extent of this circle. we cannot include that piece of shadow in our estimation of the length of the shadow. We have to minus that. So the shadow of an object must be the same size as the object minus the shadow of the zenith. So if you add on a piece here now, then we would say once the shadow of an object reaches this point here, then the waqt of Asr has entered and the waqt of Dhuhr has expired. So simply put, the time of Dhuhr begins after the sun descends from its zenith, and it ends when an object's shadow equals its length in addition to the length of its shadow at the time of zawal, at the time of its zenith, supposed to be. Alright, so that's how you determine the waqt of Dhuhr. The beginning is immediately after the sun passes its highest point in the sky, and the end is when the shadow of an object, any object, equals the size of the object minus the shadow that was present at zenith. So I'm in Cape Town, South Africa, for example, and we are south of the Tropic of Capricorn. Therefore, whether it is summer or winter, at the time of zenith, there's always going to be shadows of objects, despite the sun being more or less right up in the sky or the highest point in the sky. That's because of the round shape of the earth. And then if you are within the tropics, then in summertime, like at the Kaaba, for example, in the heat of summer, in the middle of summer, there is going to be a point in which the Kaaba strikes no shadow on the ground because the sun would be directly above. Then the waqt of Dhuhr would enter at the time of Zawal, the moment it moves away from its highest point. And once the shadow of the Kaaba is the same height as the Kaaba, because there was no shadow at the zenith, then the waqt of Asr has entered, and Allah knows best. So that would lead us to describing the next segment of text. The time of Asr begins when the object's shadow equals its length in addition to the length of its shadow at the time of Zawal, which is exactly what we just stated. And it ends when the sun sets. So what does that mean when the sun sets? Looking at our diagram again, if you imagine this to be the sun, right? The sun, the sun will be approximately here for Asr prayer, and the sun will continue to go down. Once the sun passes the horizon, right, and the disk of the sun is now here. So you can no longer see the disk of the sun on a flat horizon, then that means the waqt of Asr has exited, it has ended, and the waqt of Maghrib has officially entered. The time of Maghrib begins from sunset. This is also important. On many contemporary calendars, modern day calendars, they have sunset there. But you have to be careful because I found that many sunset times actually indicate the time where the sun begins to set. So the disk of the sun is still visible, but it starts the process of going beneath the horizon. This is not sunset as we are describing it here. What we are describing is when the disk of the sun actually disappears. So sunset is technically over by this time. Tamam? So once the time of Maghrib begins, which is from sunset, after the sun had set, and ends with the disappearance of the red horizon. So what happens is, once the sun disappears here from the horizon, the sky still has light, a lot of light. The entire sky is practically light except for the opposite side of the sky where the sun rose earlier that day. But where the sun sets, it becomes reddish, purplish, bluish. It has rich colors. We call that the twilight. And for as long as there's this red glow in the sky, right? For as long as this red glow is prevalent, then that is still the time of Maghrib. Once that red glow, the red horizon as described here, once that disappears, then the time of Isha has begun. So the time of Isha begins from the setting of the red horizon and it ends at Subuh Sadiq. It ends, in other words, at Fajr time. So when does Fajr begin? The time of Subuh begins from dawn, breaking dawn, right? Subuh Sadiq, and it continues until sunrise. So looking at our diagram again, when the sun is about here in terms of rising, then what you see on the horizon is a thin white line across the horizon there where the sun is going to come up. You can barely see this in most modern settings because of light pollution. But if you find yourself in a desert with a clear sky, or perhaps on the ocean with a clear sky, or within unpopulated areas with a clear sky, and you can see the horizon where the sun is coming up without any mountains blocking your view, then just before the waqt of Fajr is about to enter, based on your calculation or your calendar, observe the sky, and you will see a white line clearly visible from the black line of the sky. And this is referenced in the Quran. كُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَكُمُ الْخَيْطُ الْأَبْيَضُ مِنَ الْخَيْطِ الْأَسْوَدِ مِنَ الْفَجْرِ. Concerning fasting, you may eat and drink at night until the white line becomes manifestly clear from the black line of Fajr. That point there, right, that line, that crack in the horizon, that is referred to as the break of dawn, right? The break of dawn. In Arabic, it is referred to as Subuh Sadiq. Subuh Sadiq refers to true dawn. Why true dawn, right? What has truth got to do with it? Well, there's another type of dawn that happens before this that's called false dawn. Subuh Kadhib. In English, this phenomenon is referred to as the zodiacal twilight. And in terms of its physical observation, once again, you need really the absence of light pollution to see this. I've never witnessed it myself, but it is described as a vertical ray of light that comes from the horizon, obviously very faint, but clearly vertical. So one would easily assume that this means the sun is going to come up after this, but that's not the case. That vertical lines of light disappears. Again, it's very subtle, but they disappear, and then the white line spreads across the horizon. So the vertical twilight is referred to as the zodiacal twilight or Subuh Kadhib, and that's false dawn. True dawn, to differentiate it from false dawn, is in fact a horizontal line that spreads across the horizon. That line eventually gets bigger and bigger and bigger until the whole sky is lit up. The sun hasn't risen yet. And that entire duration is Fajr. It's still Fajr. Fajr ends once the rays of the sun, once the actual rays of the sun starts to appear from the horizon. So you can actually see, okay, that's sunlight coming up there. Those are the rays of the sun. That would mark the end of the waqt of Fajr, and that concludes the 5 awqat of the prayers. So I hope that was clear. Once you understand the phenomenon of the zenith, the sun being at its highest point, the zawal, moving away from its highest point, and the way the shadows, sort of behave, then the rest of the awqat is quite fairly straightforward to understand, and Allah knows best. Then he made a comment about the horizons. He said there are 3 types of horizons: the red twilight, the yellow twilight, and the white twilight. The red horizon is at the time of Maghrib, as we've stated, while the yellow and white are at the time of Isha. Meaning, once the redness in the sky disappears, the sun set, it was Maghrib prayer. Maghrib prayer continues for as long as that red twilight is visible in the sky. Once that red twilight disappears, the sky isn't completely black yet. There's still a whitish tinge in the sky, and possibly also a yellow tinge in the sky, because the sky is still becoming darker. These phenomenon, the yellowness and the whiteness, this is part of the waqt of Isha. So he's saying it is sunnah to delay the salah of Isha until the yellow and the white horizons also disappear. And this comes from a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ as well, in which he stated, لو لم أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم بالصلاة عند نصف الليل أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. Had I not feared it to be difficult upon my ummah, I would have commanded them to pray the Salatul Isha at the half of the night. So clearly there's an indication that the Prophet ﷺ, he at times delayed the Isha till later. However, practice is stronger in this sense. So our scholars have still preferred the beginning of the waqt of Isha, as explained here, to be the best time to pray the Isha prayer, still considering the fact that it is permissible to delay for valid reasons, and Allah knows best. How much can you delay your prayer? Now it states here in the footnotes that if less than one raka'ah of one salah occurs within the proper time, meaning that one does not raise one's head from the second sajda of the raka'ah before the time ends, and the remainder of the salah takes place after it, then the entire salah is considered as qada, right? So if you delayed your prayer to the point where less than one raka'ah of your prayer falls inside of the time, and the rest of your prayer falls outside of the time, then that entire prayer is considered outside of its time, and it's a make-up salah. He also adds, it is not permissible to intentionally delay the salah until part of it is prayed after the time has terminated. So right now it is, I think it's just about to be the waqt of Asr where I am. If I delay Asr prayer, I don't pray it at the beginning, I don't pray it in the middle, I deliberately delay it till such time that part of my Asr prayer is going to actually be concluded in the Maghrib's waqt. So part of it is in the Asr's waqt, perhaps even legitimately so. Perhaps I even concluded 2 raka'at inside Asr's waqt. But part of it is outside of its waqt, right? So it moves over into the Maghrib's waqt. That there is haram. To do that deliberately is haram. Of course, if you did not do so deliberately, then you should hasten to ensure you get as much of the prayer inside of its waqt as possible. But to deliberately delay your prayer to the point where part of it falls outside of the prayer, that is haram, it is unlawful, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So that considers the 3 types of horizons, red, yellow, and white. We move on, inshallah ta'ala. I've explained this diagram, it's for your reference as well. And then I've provided the sharh from Nailur Raja, and you may refer to this for your convenience for further explanation if you so desire, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Now we move on to another very important section, and I've referred to some points here in already, and that is concerning faslun fi awqati allati tahrumu fiha as-salah, the times in which it is haram to pray. The times in which it is haram to pray. Now in some books this is referred to as the makruh times. The makruh times of prayer. So for example, in the contemporary work al-Fiqh al-Manhaji, the scholars they refer to it as a makruh time to pray. But then in the istilahi explanations, in the explanation of what they mean thereby, they explain that this is like a type of makruh tahrimi. However, the concept of makruh tahrimi does not exist in the Shafi'i school, right? For the most part, we have haram and we have makruh. And then we have mubah, and we have mustahab, and we have fard. The Hanafi school has further details, like makruh is divided into makruh tahrimi and makruh tanzihi. So there's prohibitively disliked, and then there's just disliked. For the Shafi school, we don't have this. If something is prohibitively disliked, it is considered haram. So be that as it may, the point here is, when you read the disliked times of prayer from a Shafi'i text, you should understand that that actually means the prohibited times of the prayer, right? So tahrumu salatu, the salah is haram, allati laysa laha sababun mutaqaddimun, if it does not have a preceding cause, wala muqarinun, nor a coinciding cause, fi khamsati awqatin, during 5 times. So what is this about the preceding cause? A preceding cause of prayer is when you do an action and then as a result of that action you pray. Does that make it clear? As you do an action and as a result of doing that action you then pray. So for example, somebody enters the masjid and as a result of entering the masjid the sunnah is now to pray tahiyyat al-masjid. That is a salah with a preceding cause. An example of a prayer with a post cause, if you will, meaning the reason for you praying actually happens after the prayer, is the sunnahs of the ihram. So it is recommended in the Shafi'i school and other scholars as well that when you enter into the state of ihram, you should pray 2 raka'at first and then enter into the state of ihram. But entering into the state of ihram takes place after the salah. So that is not a preceding cause. That cause comes afterwards. Another example of a preceding cause is perhaps the tahiyyatul wudu. So it is sunnah based on the practice of Sayyidina Bilal radiallahu ta'ala, and then of course affirmed by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that when we perform wudu, it is sunnah to pray 2 raka'at as tahiyyatul wudu, to welcome your wudu by praying your salah, or to honor your wudu by praying your salah. So once again, you first performed the ablution and then you prayed. So the cause of the prayer happened before the prayer itself. That is what is referred to by لَيْسَ لَهَا سَبَبٌ مُتَقَدِّمٌ. Sababun mutaqaddimun is a preceding cause. وَلَا مُقَارِنٌ. Muqarinun refers to a coinciding cause, something that happens simultaneously. So unless it's that type of prayer, then it is haram to pray in these following times. عند طلوع الشمس, at the time of sunrise, meaning while the sun is rising. حتى ترتفع قدر رمح, until it has risen the extent of a spear's length. Now this is not a literal measurement, this is an apparent measurement. In other words, during sunrise, one shouldn't pray. And then once the sun rises to the point where it looks like you could fit a spear there, right? So it's an estimation. It looks like you could fit a spear in the horizon between the sun and the horizon, then that would be sufficient time that has passed and you may now pray once again. Next, وَعِنْدَ الْإِسْتِوَاءِ. Remember we spoke about the sun's zenith, and in Arabic that is istiwa. So at the time of istiwa, when the sun is at its highest point, في غير يوم الجمعة, except on the day of Friday. Right? Friday is an exception to this, obviously because of the Jumu'ah prayer and the significance of the time, and prayer is welcomed in that time. حتى تزول, until the sun has moved away from that point, meaning until you have reached zawal. So we've got 2 times so far: during sunrise, until the sun has risen enough; at the time of the sun's highest position in the sky, until it moves away from the highest position; then وَعِنْدَ الْإِصْفِرَارِ, at the time of sunset, essentially, once the sun, or the disk of the sun starts disappearing from the horizon, حَتَّى تَغْرُبَ, until the disk has completely disappeared. Right, so sunrise, highest point, sunset. وَبَعْدَ الصَّلَاةِ الصُّبْحِ, after the Fajr prayer, حَتَّى تَطْلُعَ الشَّمْسُ, until the sun had risen, which is technically part of the first point, but he's mentioning it separately because of specific situations. وَبَعْدَ الصَّلَاةِ الْعَصْرِ, and after the Asr prayer, حَتَّى تَغْرُبَ, until the sun had set. Again, that point is part of the third point, but he's mentioning it for a specific reason. So now that we've covered the times in theory, let's look at the explanation of this, inshaAllah ta'ala. Firstly, there are 5 times in a day in which it is haram to pray. It is neither haram nor makruh to offer salah within the haram of Makkah al-Mukarramah at any time. So what we are describing here does not apply to the person inside the haram of Makkah al-Mukarramah. They may pray at any time regardless of what is being described here. Secondly, why, and this is not mentioned here, but why would there be unlawful times of prayer? The scholars have explained this in much longer works, saying that Islam uses the sun for determining the prayer's times, but very emphatically does not worship or does not even want to resemble worshipping the sun. I mean, this is clear from the Quran. Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, he tells his people about this is the sun, this is my Lord, trying to demonstrate to the people that the sun is in fact powerless, and the sun disappears, and he says, no, the sun cannot be my Lord doesn't disappear. So we know that Muslims worship only Allah Azza wa Jal, and we don't worship the sun or the moon or any other type of bodies. But Allah has given us the sun and the moon to determine time. So we use the sun as an indicator of time, but to differentiate between worshipping Allah and others who worship the sun, certain times when the sun is at its most honorable positions, it is unlawful to pray for a Muslim. What do we mean by honorable positions? At which times do we want to look at the sun, or do we consider the sun as an amazing phenomenon? Generally speaking, it's going to be at 3 times. While the sun is rising, people say, oh, watch the sunrise today. While the sun is setting, people say, oh, watch the sunset today. And people take photos of it and they're like, why? Because it's a beautiful phenomenon. And when the sun is at its highest point, because then it's extremely intense in heat, again, depending on the context. So at these times, we don't pray. Once these times pass, then we pray. So that's an essential, type of logical wisdom that falls in this framework. But that's as far as we need to explain or understand for now. The next point that he mentions is to offer those salahs which do not have an immediate or preceding cause. Now I've explained that. Footnote number 46. The salah is unlawful and invalid, and it will not discharge a person from a vow. It is permissible at the above times to offer salah that are performed for particular reasons, such as Salatul Janaza, Tahiyyat al-Masjid, the Sunnah after wudu, and it is also permissible to make qada salah, though one may not perform the 2 rak'ahs that are Sunnah before entering the state of Ihram. Now, why does he add the qada salah? Because even though it is haram to initiate a prayer at these times, prayers that should have been offered in the past but were neglected, in other words, it is qada, they may also be prayed at any time, because the causes for those prayers have, of course, long preceded. So if you owe qada umri, right, you owe missed salahs of your life in the past, you can make those up at any time. You don't have to concern yourself with these prohibited times. Similarly, a person who missed a prayer yesterday or earlier in the day, they may pray at any time. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. Then the final point that I wish to make here is the extreme difficulty in capturing the waqt of istiwa. When the sun is at its highest point in the sky, to start a salah at that time would literally require somebody to wait for the sun to reach its highest point and at that moment say Allahu Akbar, because it's only a moment. The sun moves beyond its highest point immediately after that moment. So it's not really a time that you need to be cautious of, because it is unlikely that you're going to be able to coincide your prayer with that particular time. So that's just a side note from myself. As for sunrise and sunset, Allah has made this fairly easy for us, because after you pray the fard salah of Fajr, there is no sunnah salah. And the reason for there not being a sunnah salah, there are many reasons and wisdoms, but Allah has chosen that system as such. So you are also reminded that it's not the time that you're supposed to be praying in. The same thing applies with Asr. After the Asr prayer, there's no sunnah salahs. You're supposed to be engaging in dhikrullah, recitation of Quran and the like, but not to engage in further prayer, and Allah knows best. Tamam. So that's essentially all we need to discuss here. We've given the exceptions, and there's really nothing more to it than just to understand that you shouldn't pray unrestricted prayers that do not have preceding reasons and is not qada prayers, and you are not in the haram of Makkah, and it is not the day of Jumu'ah for that certain category that we mentioned. That is all that you really need to be aware of, that it is unlawful to pray unrestricted prayers during those times. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. There's the sharh from Nailul Raja, and that actually concludes our discussion. Now you may have questions about this, because there were some technicalities, and that's perfectly understandable. If so, remember we have the answers forum, or rather the class participation forum. So you log onto your Moodle page through seekersguidance.org. You go to your course, you go to ask your question, you type in your question, and you can either address it to myself or to your classmates, depending on the nature of the question, and we'll deal with it, inshallah, and we can all learn from there collectively. Of course, this is only accessible if you have registered for the course. So if you haven't done so, please do register as soon as possible. There's a lot of benefit to registering as opposed to just watching this on social media, because you'll have access to the recordings basically forever, inshallah. You will also have access to the quizzes, multiple choice quizzes, which are designed to test your knowledge and see whether you've met the minimum criteria to pass to the next class. And thirdly, you also receive the notes that we are utilizing here as a means of revision, which includes the sharh of the text. So do register for that, inshallah ta'ala. What have we done in this lesson? We have looked at the conditions of prostration. We have looked at the times of prayer. We've looked at the unlawful times of prayer, among other things like the tashdeedat, the sunnahs of the salah. Barakallahu ta'ala fikum. I'll leave you with a question, inshallah. Is it lawful for somebody to pray all their prayers once they return from home in the evening after they had worked, to basically make up for the day's prayers in a sort of a all-in-one format? Is this lawful? Is there nothing wrong with this? Is this perfectly fine? You should be able to answer this question by now, among many other questions that have been formulated for you in the multiple choice quiz, inshallah ta'ala. But alhamdulillah, that leads us to the end of our lesson. Jazakumullahu khairan for joining me. Until next time, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad, subhanallahi wa bihamdi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum.